All right, well, thanks, Carl and Bill, for that context setting. What I'll do now is kind of zoom back into the proposed Lincoln Park project and what we know about it, what we don't know about it, some of the thinking that we've been doing here at CLP about it. So, as you know, this is proposed to be a combination of a 20 megawatt battery storage unit and a 20 megawatt gas and diesel generator. So that's big for a storage project. It's not big as a power plant goes, but it's not tiny either. It's kind of in a mid-range there. And so the things I'll talk about are, first of all, what do we know about what the climate emissions might be from this project? How big are they? I'll talk about the emissions rate, what we can expect in terms of total annual emissions, how big is that, and some of the claims that GlidePath has made about this project reducing emissions on the system or supporting clean energy and how we can evaluate that. We'll ask some questions about the possible air pollutant emissions. We don't know a lot about that yet. And then I want to think about why are they proposing this project here? And the question that I think a lot of people asked at the meeting the other night, why not just build a storage only project, right? With all this really exciting stuff going on in the storage industry, why are they proposing this weird hybrid thing? So that's what we'll talk about. Starting with the carbon emissions rate. GlidePath has told me this week that they expect that the emissions rate from the generator portion of this project will be about 800 to 850 pounds per megawatt hour of generation. So not 195, which is what they told us the other night at the meeting. So I asked them that night. I think 195 is physically impossible. And last week they called me up and said, "You're right, we made a mistake in our spreadsheet, sorry." So even at 800 to 850, that would be really astonishingly efficient for a gas engine. It would be the most efficient such project that exists in the country. Now, there are manufacturers who are building engines that are this efficient, apparently, and so it makes sense that they would install the most efficient one they could get, but even 800 to 850 is pretty aggressive. That's about 47 to 50% efficiency, so those of you who know engines know that's pretty darn efficient. For comparison, so you might remember GlidePath put up a slide with that 195, and they said, well, a coal plant is up around 200 pounds per megawatt, 2,000 pounds per megawatt hour. That's not really a good comparison for us because the coal plants in New York State are all going to be gone within a couple of years. So I suggested that they take that off the slide because it's really not a good comparison for our context. So what most of the fossil plants in this state are emitting at is somewhere in between 800 to 1,400 pounds per megawatt hour. So if their 800 to 850 is right, it would be at the low end of the emissions rate for gas burning plants. And that's because it's newer than most of them. Most of these are older. A new combined cycle plant, which is the most efficient type of gas plant, would be a little bit more efficient than that. So somewhere in the 700 to 800 pounds per megawatt hour range. So what can we expect then for total emissions over the course of the year? GlidePath says that their best guess is that this project the generator will be running on average about 4 to 6 hours per day. It'll operate more in the summer and winter when loads are higher and less in the fall and the spring when loads are lower. So it might be running 24 hours a day on hot summer days, and it might go a couple weeks at a time in the spring without running at all. They don't know exactly how much they'll operate. The New York energy market is an auction. Generators bid into it. They say, we'll put our energy onto the system if you pay us at least this much. And that how much they pay is basically, or how much they bid is based on how much it costs for them to run their plants. So the more efficient a plant is, the less fuel it has to buy, the better its bid is going to be. And then the NISO picks the bid, the highest bid that they need to meet all the energy needs that we have, and everybody gets paid that highest amount. So if on days when the peak loads are really high, as Bill said, that price gets bid way up. Everybody else makes that highest bid amount. So you get paid the gap, basically, between the least efficient generator on the system and what you cost. So the Lincoln Park plant would be pretty efficient, as we saw, and so it's likely that its bid will win fairly often when loads are high. So 4 to 6 hours per day on average, it's probably not a bad estimate. So that's what I've gone with in trying to estimate the total annual emissions. So if we take 6 hours per day, 20 megawatts, 850 pounds per megawatt hour, and just multiply that out, it's about 37 million pounds of CO2 per year. And many of you at the meeting the other night rightly asked, okay, but what about the upstream methane emissions? If we add a 2.5% methane leak, which is, roughly in the range, there's a lot of estimates about this. We don't exactly know how big those methane leaks are, but 2.5% is somewhere in the range. We have a 20-year CO2 equivalent. That's about another 30,000 pounds of CO2 per year, so almost doubling that emissions rate.
30 million.
Sorry, 30 million, thank you. So if we turn that into the total tons of CO2 equivalent, it's about 30,000 metric tons. Turns out that's, I went and looked in the Hudson Valley inventory, that's about equal to the emissions of all the households in the town of Ulster. Not all the emissions in Ulster, but just out of the household. So that's the electricity you consume, the gas or the oil in your furnace, not your cars, but just coming out of the housing stock. So that's roughly the scale. It's also about 1.5% of all of the county emissions. Okay, so again, not super huge, but not insignificant either, right? And certainly moving in the wrong direction. GlidePath is putting out an argument that this project, although it's a fossil project, is supporting clean energy and it's supporting renewables. That it's going to displace higher emitting generation on the system and that it's going to help renewables operate more. And I want to break down that argument for you because it's theoretically correct and yet I think it's not really appropriate to our context. So this is the argument. We have to have generators standing by on the system to meet peak capacity. We also have to have generators, as Carl said, standing by to give us moment-to-moment demand backup and also kind of minute-to-minute. So that's those ancillary services. The frequency regulation, that's your moment-to-moment balancing the grid. Spinning reserves are if something trips off someplace else, you can come on really quick within a few minutes. And so if you use a big combined cycle plant for those backup needs, those things, when you turn them on, you gotta leave them on for hours. So they can't come on and off really quickly. And so what GlidePath is saying is, we've got these super flexible batteries, we've got this super flexible engine. It can do that second by second and minute by minute regulation without you needing to turn on that larger power plant. Now, in places where there's a lot of renewable energy on the system, where we're talking 20, 30% renewable energy, what can happen is, say the wind drops out, there's not a lot of wind blowing, and so you turn on one of the gas plants to make it up. And then that big gas plant has to keep running for several hours before you can turn it back down. While that's going on, the wind comes back, and the grid operator says, sorry, we can't take you right now, we've got the gas plant running. And that's called curtailment. So you can't absorb the renewable energy on the grid because you've got these larger inflexible fossil plants that you've got committed and they need to keep running. And so what GlidePath is saying is we can avoid that because we can be moment to moment, up, down, up, down, up, down, without that need to keep it committed. And that would make sense someplace like California or Germany where they've got so many renewables on the system that curtailment is starting to be an issue. That's not the case here. We had, I looked it up tonight, 0.5% curtailment of wind in New York State over the last couple of years. Most of that is way upstate, not around here, so it's not on our portion of the transmission grid. And it was mostly due to transmission lines being down to those wind plants, not to there being too much energy. So in theory, someday, when we have much more wind and solar on the grid, it might be that we might say, well, we would really like some super responsive, flexible fossil plant that we can turn up and down whenever we want to in order to help balance out those renewables. But we're not there yet. And there's lots of other ways we can get flexibility on the system. We can have batteries only. We can have our electric vehicles that are all hooked up to the grid and responding to those moment-to-moment signals. So by the time we get to the point here in New York State where we might need this kind of additional flexibility reserves, there are lots of other cleaner technologies that might come along to do it. And so I wanted to break that down for you because I think this is something we're going to hear GlidePath say over and over. Well, if you're going to have renewables, you've got to have fossil to back them up. That's not true here now. We're not at that point yet.
But GlidePath says, well, those battery storage only last 4 hours. They're short term.
Right, and so we've got, right now, we're in the position where we've got lots of fossil generation on the whole New York State grid to balance it out, so we don't need to add this more. But there is something about that short duration, which I'll get to in the end, because that is an issue. Okay, so other emissions impacts. What about air pollution? Nitrous oxides, carbon monoxide, smog, asthma. The answer is we don't know yet. They didn't fill out that portion of their environmental application form. They're going to do a whole air study apparently once the scoping is done. And so we don't know yet anything about that, but it's something really important for us to study. And this is connected to a question that I think is really interesting, which is, why are they proposing this project here? Because as we've said, we know that the load in this region is, the peak load in this region is declining. We don't need this peak capacity here. Well, our air quality here in Ulster County has been improving in recent years to the point where in the last several years we haven't had any unhealthy air quality days at all. This is not true everywhere else in the state, and it's not true downstate where they really do need this, this additional peak capacity. So where the load is, the air quality is worse than ours, and it's much harder to get your air permits that you need to build a facility like this in places that the EPA has designated as having bad air quality. So this is a map of how many air quality, how many types of pollution your county is violating in terms of EPA standards. And you know, we're just in a remarkably clean place, which I think we all know intuitively. But that is literally why they are proposing this project here, because they think they can get the permits more easily here, because our air has room for pollution in it. So finally, why not build a storage-only project? As Bill mentioned, there's a lot of work going on right now to meet this really ambitious 1.5 gigawatt storage goal. Why on earth propose a project like this? I spoke with one of the people at NYSERDA who's managing the storage program, and we talked about this a lot. And his basic conclusion was 2018 is just an in-between year for New York State, where the storage technology is coming up and the market is coming up, but we don't quite have the market rules in place to make this project work. And the big issue there is that this project is proposed to play into this backup capacity market. And right now in New York State, the rules say if you're going to be backup capacity, you have to be available for as many hours as we want to call on you for. And the batteries have limited capacity. And so if they were a storage-only project under the current rules, and they got called upon, and their batteries ran out during that period of time that they have to be available for, they would be like violating their contract for providing backup capacity service. And if they did that more than a few times, they would be kicked out of the market. And so what's needed is just to rewrite those rules so that storage projects have their own kind of niches that they can fit in. And this has been done in the New Jersey power market, it's been done in the California power market, so it's not like it can't be done, it just hasn't been done here yet. And in fact, NYSO is kind of furiously working on this right now and doing modeling and testing things, and there will probably be rules for this out early in 2019, and things getting finalized and refined over the next few years. So this project is just coming along a little bit too soon for that. The flip side of that is, if it should come to pass that the permitting process takes a year or two, then there might be a really different rule environment that might make this viable as a storage-only project. Now, GlidePath has never built a project like this before. They're a storage and renewables company. I don't really understand how they convinced themselves that this was a great thing for them to do in order to get into the New York State market, because their core business has not been fossil stuff. They've not built a fossil project before. You know, talking at CLP, we're hoping that it might come to pass that this whole thing will look differently, and this project might be restructured. I don't know if that's a pie in the sky hope or a viable hope, but you know, certainly it's in the case that in other states, as Carl said, storage is competitive with peaking plants. California's Public Utility Commission has told its utilities, don't come to us with another proposal for a gas-fired peaker plant until you've thoroughly evaluated the economics of storage. We want to see those. So that can happen here too. And this project right now is just unfortunately falling into this little gap where New York State is not quite ready for storage only.